Have you got true grit and perseverance? Let's find out right now on the Leadership Voice. Welcome to the Leadership Voice. I'm your host, Jay Barbuto. Today's show is about true grit and perseverance. Joining me today is Troy Underwood, a serial entrepreneur and best-selling author of his book that just came out called How to Launch Your Side Hustle. Troy Underwood is a great community member and a great supporter of the Center for Leadership. Please welcome Troy Underwood.
Good to be here, Jay.
Troy, thanks so much for coming on the show with us. Troy, let's talk about your first big company that you built, which was FDI Consulting. And could you tell us about how you built that company? And a lot of people may not be all that familiar with what that company did.
Well, sure, happy to. FDI started out, I was doing software development, IT consulting. When you're a computer science guy and you're working in Silicon Valley in the 80s, everything is just kind of magical because you can do amazing things. And I started to turn business rules, business opportunities, and automate them. But I looked at some of the banking stuff I had been doing. I made custom software for a number of different industries, but I knew eventually I wanted to pick one rather than just trade time for dollars where I was doing just individual consulting. I wanted to be able to build an enterprise, a company, and kind of leverage that. So I was working in banking, and the credit union and the banks that I was working with, I was working on the automobile side. So we started working with the DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles here in California, electronically automating their motor vehicle titles rather than paper. So trying to convince hundreds of banks across the state or eventually across the nation that not only do they not need paper, they don't want the paper. Paper is actually a burden to them in every way, higher risk, higher storage costs, higher handling costs. Everything about it was worse than the electronic alternative. But to try to convince bankers of that and attorneys and administrators was really a challenge. It's interesting, as a software developer, the challenge to me wasn't writing the software. It was incorporating the entire business scenario around the software. All we did was just get rid of the paper. So we were selling nothing. You have nothing to lose, nothing to handle, nothing to store, nothing to mail. I could literally do the work of 100 people, literally. And it was just such a mind shift, paradigm shift in the way that banks and credit unions and captive finance companies handled motor vehicle titles that it was initially hard to get some traction. I mean, a few credit unions were really quick, a few banks were really quick, but to try to convince the others, it really, really took some effort. I mean, I was successful at it. Ultimately, I think my software has processed more motor vehicle titles than all other title processing systems combined, over the last few decades. So that's quite a success. But the mind shift was actually in the whole process, not just the software, which is very exciting.
Now, when you think about it, how long did it take, would you say, for the company to reach its the point where you said, wow, maybe I might even think about new opportunities? Like when did it reach a point where you'd say it was a success?
It didn't jump out as a success immediately. So, I was in it for 5-6 years before I allowed myself, and maybe that's the word, we allow yourself to say, wow, this is successful. I always knew it would be successful. I mean, then part of it and that grit and that perseverance is to not only just have confidence in yourself, which I did, still do, but I also had confidence in the market, in the software, in the team, in the whole economy in that sense, that we were going the right direction. It was very difficult sometime in the mid 80s to convince people that the internet was actually useful for something more than just email and porn. It had actual business to it, which of course now anybody growing up, there's nobody at the Center for Leadership that would disagree with that. But you go back to 1986, 1987, when I first started doing stuff, and I'd been using the internet on a daily basis since 1982. So, I went to Florida eventually, and I asked every financial institution in Florida that attended our conferences. So maybe talking to 100 banks and credit unions, and literally none of them in the very early 90s had used the internet for any business transactions. So our web-enabled, you can use this thing called a browser, was all very, very brand new. We just loved being on the very cutting edge of that.
Could you talk a little bit, Troy, about some of the sacrifices you had to make with that first company? Personal sacrifices.
Personal sacrifices were immense. Personally, I would sacrifice almost anything. I wouldn't sacrifice my family, time with my wife and children. I wouldn't sacrifice my health. But outside of that, working long hours was almost out of necessity. Because part of it, in my book, you mentioned earlier, How to Launch Your Side Hustle, Start and Scale a Business with Minimal Capital. I didn't go to Sand Hill and get a $50 million investment. I started it with the change in the couch. I mean, I had to use whatever means necessary, and I would frequently do independent consulting. So I would write software for other people, get paid by the hour. And then in the evenings, I would go back to writing, my true dream, the one that I thought would succeed. And I was right there, but you'd go home, you'd spend time with the kids, you'd go to their soccer practices. And then after they're in bed, then you work for a few more hours. And that's just what you had to do to make this work. So if anybody thinks they can, other people do it differently, and they're perfectly fine doing that. They can go out and get a $50 million venture capital investment or a lot of loans or whatever. I just didn't take that route.
Now, a lot of people in your situation might not have had the perseverance to stick it out. I remember when you and I were talking about that first company with FDI, that you even held paychecks from time to time to yourself and didn't cash them.
Oh, for months. I mean, I was sitting on 12 paychecks, so 6 months worth of paychecks. Until you land the next big, client. That's the way I could manage cash flow, because the employees always had to get paid first. And it's really tough. Once you start and it's just you, that's pretty easy. And then you add a few employees, and now you've got a dozen employees. And now you're growing into a real company, and payroll's tough, and you have to manage cash flow. It's a little bit easier in some respects to go out there and get the capital and the financing and let somebody else deal with that. And that even gets into the definition of an entrepreneur. Matter of fact, one time I debated Elon Musk on this topic, and we were talking about entrepreneur. And the typical definition, the economists say, his definition was the intermediary between labor and capital. So his capital raise was go to Sand Hill or wherever, sell PayPal, whatever, and you've got your capital and you hire someone else to do the labor. I was so small at that point that my capital was from my right hand and my labor was from my left hand, and I would still consider myself an entrepreneur. He disagreed. I respect his opinion there, but anybody that is going to improve the value chain, I'm not talking about somebody who just went out and bought a Chevron gas station. They didn't do anything different than 1,000 other Chevron owners have done, or 7-Eleven or McDonald's or anything. They're doing the same exact thing. Maybe they're called an entrepreneur, maybe not. They're really a small business owner. I was very entrepreneurial. I had the entrepreneurial mindset and really wanted to change the status quo, change the processes and the procedures that were used in different business. And that's what I set out to do.
So your company, it made it a success. You eventually sold the company, and then a few years after selling the company, the market crashed in 2008. What happened there?
Well, the sale was a success. We sold it for over $100 million, and that was absolutely fantastic. One thing I mentally would never, it's like you can't let yourself believe the hype. So if I had stock, for example, I would never let myself believe that it was real. There's certain things that are real and certain things that you got to keep working. You can't just keep struggling forever. You got to at one time pat yourself on the back and say, well done. But what I did when we sold it is I invested in a lot of different things. I thought I was smart. I thought I was diversified. I thought I did everything right. And literally everything I touched in 2008 went bankrupt. It's like, oh no, well, that's not good. So I had to start over.
So you started over. So everything that you built and all of the wealth that you had created, you had to go back to the starting point. And so you started your next major company. Tell us about that one.
So Benefits Connect, it's kind of the same idea, the SaaS model. So I was really good at the software. I could look at a business application, reduce the cumbersome paper-intensive process. We did electronic enrollment and eligibility for health insurance and different types of insurance products. So we worked with a lot of insurance carriers. We worked with a lot of employers and health insurance brokers, and we automated their process. So an employee, rather than filling out 5 or 6 different enrollment applications for medical, dental, vision, cancer, life, disability, basically repeating the same exact stuff, we had them fill out the information online one time, and then we would electronically feed all the different carriers. When we first started doing it, it was pretty cutting edge. Same thing with the electronic titles. Now they're standard. Everybody does it. Most states do it. Same thing with the electronic eligibility and enrollment. So we were in there pretty early, tried to convince people you don't want to do a paper enrollment, do it electronically, it'll be better. And that ended up being quite successful too.
Well, I guess that's a sign that your ideas are good ones when several years later, the idea or the concept is common sense.
Sure, yes.
Because now everybody says, oh yeah, of course. But at the time it was new to market. So that's really cool. So you built this second company and you eventually sold that. But before that, let's talk about that time between when you had lost everything and you had to either give up on everything or persevere and develop that deep grit to start all over and essentially walk down that same path, that same journey, a different path, but same journey. Tell us about how you never gave up.
Well, for me, it was really, I know it sounds kind of trite, but failure was not an option. If you want to eat, failure's not an option. Mm-hmm. I couldn't just walk away and say, oh, that's okay, I'll go drive a taxi again. I had skills. It's not that I couldn't have got a job. I have marketable computer skills. I now probably have something managerial. I mean, I can do stuff, I think. But I was very driven to basically be doing my own thing. It was really kind of fun. When I was at IBM, I loved and respected that there's such an incredible talent there. But at some other companies, I would just want to go into the company and say, well, I can do it so much better than you guys are doing, so why won't you let me? So that was always a little bit frustrating. You had to be working with people that were really pushing the envelope and were very brilliant and creative and wonderful and exciting and all that. The perseverance, the grit, failure is not an option. I just had to look at it and say, what gives me joy, what really motivates me? The twisted thing about it is you go out there and you have a lot of money and then you lose it all. And then it almost, and this sounds a little twisted, but invigorated me. It's like, oh, it's yes, I have to do it again, but to a certain extent it was, oh, I get to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
So you're like, ooh, let's go build the same thing again, which is a little bit different. If I didn't have to, then you come up against a hurdle or, some barrier, and then you just say, that was too much trouble, I'll move on. But when you have to do it, it's too much trouble to move on. It'll knock down every hurdle, knock down every barrier, and make it a success, whatever you have to do. And actually, it's kind of weird when you're running it yourself like that. And then after a while, some months are good and some months are bad. And after a while, you're like, we had 6 or 7 or 8 profitable, 9, 10 very profitable months in a row, which is weird. After working for years going, okay, how are we going to make payroll? And to be profitable at the end, it's wonderful. But you're like, what is wrong with this picture? Why is it not? It's like, oh, I got enough money to now hire another person. So that's kind of fun.
Let's talk about sacrifices the second time around. So the first time with FDI, you said you were willing to sacrifice anything, and you did. You made many financial and personal sacrifices. The second time around, you're a little bit further along in life, have maybe more established things happening. Were there some sacrifices that you weren't willing to compromise that the second time around that maybe you were willing to compromise the first time around?
No, same thing with the health, with the family. I wouldn't compromise that at all. I mean, I always went to my daughter's soccer games, music performances, parent-teacher conferences. I'd fly across the country if I had to, and then turn around and fly right back. So that was never in either company. That was never an option. And I always wanted to take out a little time. It doesn't have to be every day. Some days are 12, 14, 16 hours. But other days, make sure you go for a bike ride or meditate or do some yoga or go for a walk on the beach or something for yourself. So I always did that. So never changed really from the first to the second in that. And as far as the grit goes, I look at grit as more than just perseverance. Anybody can persevere, but the grit, there's an integrity involved in grit that goes beyond just perseverance. I was working with a giant credit union one time who threatened to sue me. And I said, for what? I haven't done anything. And she laughed at me and said, oh, you're so naive. We'll bear you in legal costs. Of course, you haven't done anything. You did everything by the contract. But we want more, and we want it now, and you have no options. So say yes. And I just wouldn't do it, even if I lost the company. So that type of grit, I think goes beyond, that's the integrity that goes beyond just perseverance. Later, actually, that lady, that vice president, complimented me for standing up to the dishonest business. That'll come up sometime in business. Somebody will sue you and you got to decide whether you want to fight it or pay it. I always did the right thing, but sometimes I would pay when I shouldn't have legally. But sometimes it's an expedient business to pay.
All right. So let's give some advice. If somebody was starting a business or if somebody was facing adversity, facing challenges, what advice would you give somebody from a grit standpoint if they were going to be starting a business, starting a company?
Plan on the long haul. Don't give up after a short period of time. And that short period of time can change. It may be a few years, it may be a decade. So don't give up when you hit the first few hurdles. You can work through those, and don't let everybody else tell you what a bad idea it is. If you really believe in it, go do it. The other thing too is don't overestimate passion. Sometimes you hear people saying, oh, you have to be passionate about it. Yes, you have to be passionate about it, but you also have to be intelligent about it. And you have to open your eyes and look at the reality of it. So if you have a dozen friends and they're all telling you the same thing, it is possible that they're right. So consider both options before you just invest everything into it. I went all in that sense because I knew I was right. I knew eventually the internet would be successful, that electronic titles would be successful, electronic eligibility and enrollment. But I'm not always right on everything. So you just got to make sure you balance the two. Never give up on your principles as far as, your integrity. It's very bad in business to mislead a client or a prospect. It will come back and bite you. Never do it. And over communicate with your clients. If you make a mistake, tell them, I made a mistake. I will correct it, and tell them when you're going to correct it, and never leave them in the dark.
No, that's terrific advice. Troy, we do have a few questions from our audience, so let's go ahead and turn to those. Our first question comes from Manuel in Long Beach. Manuel asks, how did you know you had an entrepreneurial mindset? Like, at what age did you discover this?
I discovered it in literally elementary school. I was living in San Diego. I would sell, I remember one, Cheerful House greeting cards. I don't even know if they still exist. I would go door to door and take orders for customized, personalized greeting cards. And I would have literally fill the garage up with boxes of greeting cards. And then I would deliver them. And one, you made money at it. And then two, you started to develop a business, and I would have some of the other neighbor kids help me. Sometimes my brothers would help me. I would sell seeds door to door, chocolate, anything like that I could run as a little business. When I got a little older, high school, I remember my TRS-80 Model 1, but I bought a whole bunch of them. I didn't buy just one. I bought one, I used it, I programmed it, I loved it. But then I would buy others, and I'd buy it with the software, and then I would sell it. And these people liked business, so I'd sell the business software with them, with that package. The gamers, I'd sell the gaming software. And I didn't even really think about it too much, but it was just enough. Okay, we have to go do what we can do, for Boy Scouts. I remember starting a recycling program where I'd put out bins at all the neighbors and say, put your bottles and your aluminum cans in here. And I'd walk around once a week and pick them all up. And we made enough money to buy our backpacks and camping equipment. So I always did stuff like that to make money to do whatever it was I wanted to do. I followed, my grandfather was a self-employed, my dad was a self-employed. So it was just very natural for me to do that. I didn't mind having a job, but I always did something entrepreneurial.
Yeah, it sounds like it's been running through your blood the whole time. We have another question. Our second question comes from Leslie in Arcadia. Leslie asks, how do you stay positive when you fail?
Well, that's very difficult. Sometimes it's like a feedback. When you're feeling down, sometimes a psychologist or counselor or something will tell you to force a smile. Just force it until you believe it, until your body believes that you are indeed smiling, and as such, you are happy. So there can be a little bit of a I don't want to call it a lie, but tricking your body into believing it. So sometimes you just have to remain positive. I'm not great at that, in the sense that, you listen to the Tony Robbins and they're great, but I'm not a rah, come on, platitude, give 110%. As an economist, I don't give 110%. As an exercise physiologist, if your max heart rate is 200, there is no such thing as 201. By definition, you're dead. So I look at those things. Maybe I studied too much math and economics and physiology to really absorb the sales approach platitudes. Come on, team, go, you can do it. I was always very energetic about that and very optimistic and positive, but I knew a lot of salespeople who were more optimistic and positive, to the point of just being out of touch with reality. But sometimes being out of touch with reality and forcing yourself to just keep going in spite of, all these negative, it's just what you have to do. So I looked at it out of necessity. Failure is not an option. you have to keep going, whether you had a bug in your software or, whether you lost a large client, whatever it is, or whether you lost all your money, and you just have to keep going.
Oh, that's terrific. So we have one more question. And our third question, Troy, it comes from Soham from Laguna Hills. Soham asks, who was your mentor growing up? How were they helpful in shaping your career?
I'd say the person that I followed the most, just because I saw him every day, was my father. Like I said, also my grandfather. He ran his own shop. Different professions. My father's a chiropractor. My grandfather was a construction worker, carpenter, cabinet maker. And I just watched what they do. They set their own hours. They were long hours. It's not like, you can just go to the beach. I always disliked the platitudes that you'd hear from someplace like Amway. Come on, it'll be a permanent vacation. It's not a permanent vacation. It's a lot of work. Watch your father work, and that's where you're going to get your work ethic. And I always did. So that was just very normal. Now, to a certain extent, I disagree with some of it. So I made tweaks for my own satisfaction, my own life, that I wouldn't do certain things. But you just look around, and in business, I had a few people that I watched in the business world that I knew very well. And I saw what they did that I liked. And I saw what they did that I didn't like. One, Arlen Turner, I knew in college. He got me into writing software for banks. He was a banker. And I also watched the different real estate investors and how they just made very creative ways to run a business.
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you so much, Troy, for sharing. And thank you also for coming on the show with us to talk about true grit and perseverance.
It's a pleasure to be here.
That's great. So today we talked about true grit and perseverance, and we're honored to have been joined by Troy Underwood. Join us each episode of The Leadership Voice as we bring you great themes and topics to continue your leadership journey. And please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our videos. On behalf of the Center for Leadership, I'm Jay Barbuto, and we'll see you next time right here on The Leadership Voice.